Thunder split the Wyoming sky like God's own rifle shot, but Sarah Brennan didn't flinch. She'd heard gunfire before, real gunfire that took lives and shattered families. This was just nature reminding everyone who truly owned the prairie. Rain hammered the wooden shutters of her cabin as she worked by lamplight, sorting through what remained of her medical supplies. 3 rolls of clean linen, a bottle of carbolic acid, and her late husband's surgical kit, the one he'd carried through the war before settling out here to forget what men could do to each other. The storm had been building all day, dark clouds rolling across Black Elk Valley like an army of shadows. Most folks would have battened down and waited it out, but Sarah had work to do. The vegetable garden needed tending, the chicken coop required repairs, and there was always something breaking on a homestead run by a widow with a 6-year-old daughter. She glanced toward the small bed in the corner where Clara slept, golden curls spilling across the patchwork quilt Sarah had sewn from scraps of their old life back east. The child could sleep through anything: storms, coyote howls, even the occasional gunshot from drunken cowboys passing through. It was a blessing, that deep sleep of innocence. Sarah hadn't slept soundly since Benjamin died 8 months ago, taken not by violence, but by fever that burned through him in 3 days despite all her nursing. The door shuddered against its frame, and Sarah moved to secure the bolt. That's when she heard it, not the wind, not the rain, but something else, a sound that made her blood run cold. The whinny of a horse in distress, followed by something hitting the ground hard just beyond her porch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah grabbed the Winchester from above the mantel, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Benjamin had taught her to shoot the day they'd arrived in Wyoming territory, said a woman alone needed to know how to defend herself. She'd gotten good at it too, could hit a rabbit at 50 yards, though she preferred not to kill unless necessary. The rifle felt heavy in her hands as she approached the door, pressing her ear against the wood. Nothing but rain and wind. Then, a groan. Human, male in pain. She cracked the door, rifle first, squinting through the sheets of rain illuminating by lightning flashes. A horse stood in her yard, sides heaving, an empty saddle dark with what looked like blood. And there, collapsed at the base of her porch, steps lay a figure. Sarah's lamp cast a yellow pool of light as she stepped out, rifle steady. The man was face down in the mud, and in the next lightning flash, she saw the arrow. No, arrows. 3 of them protruding from his back, their fletching distinctly native. But this was no white settler or soldier. The long black hair, the beaded leather vest, the moccasins. This was a Sioux warrior, and he was bleeding his life into her dooryard. She should have been afraid. The newspapers were full of stories about Indian raids, about the growing tensions between the tribes and the railroad companies pushing west. Just last month, a homestead 40 miles north had been burned, though nobody could prove who'd done it. Smart money said it was the railroad trying to clear folks out, but fear made people blame the tribes. The warrior groaned again, fingers clawing weakly at the mud. He was trying to crawl, to escape, though where he thought he could go in this condition was beyond imagining. Sarah lowered her rifle. Whatever had happened to this man, whoever was chasing him, he wasn't a threat to her or Clara. Not like this. "Hold still," she said, though she doubted he could hear her over the storm. She knelt beside him, her dress immediately soaking through. The arrows had punched deep, and blood seeped steadily from the wounds. Professional assessment took over. She'd helped Benjamin treat everything from gunshots to goring injuries. The arrows needed to come out, but not here, not in the rain. The warrior's eyes fluttered open as she tried to turn him. Dark eyes, unfocused with pain, but somehow still fierce. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "No!" He gasped in English. "Leave! Me!" I will, Sarah muttered. She'd buried one man already. She wasn't about to let another die on her doorstep if she could help it. You're coming inside whether you like it or not. He tried to resist, but the effort cost him his consciousness. Sarah was strong. Frontier life didn't allow for weakness, but dragging a full-grown man up her porch steps tested every muscle. She got him inside just as another massive thunderclap shook the cabin, Clara stirring but not waking. By lamplight, the wounds looked worse. 2 arrows in his back, 1 in his shoulder. They'd penetrated deep but hadn't gone all the way through. Sarah had seen arrow wounds before. Benjamin had treated several during their first year here. The key was removing them without causing more damage, then preventing infection. She laid him on the kitchen table, face down, and began cutting away his vest. The leather was beautiful work, intricate beadwork telling stories she couldn't read. Beneath it, his skin was marked with scars, old wounds that spoke of a lifetime of conflict. But also something else. Tattoos, or perhaps ceremonial markings, ran along his spine. "I'm going to help you," she said, not sure if he could hear her. "But this is going to hurt." She prepared her supplies methodically. Hot water from the kettle she always kept simmering. Benjamin's surgical tools, laid out on clean cloth, the bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. She poured some over her hands, then over the exposed wounds, causing the warrior to jerk and groan. The first arrow came out clean, the barbed head intact. Sarah pressed clean gauze against the wound, watching the blood flow slow. The second arrow broke as she extracted it, requiring careful probing to remove the head. By the time she started, on the third, the warrior was conscious again, teeth clenched against the pain. "Almost done," she murmured, working as quickly as precision allowed. "Just hold on." His fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. But he didn't cry out, didn't flinch except for the involuntary muscle spasms. Sarah had seen groan, men scream over lesser wounds. This man's control was remarkable. The third arrow came free, and she immediately packed the wound. All 3 were deep, but had missed major organs. Lucky, if being shot with arrows could ever be called lucky. She cleaned each wound thoroughly, stitched what needed stitching, and applied clean bandages. Only then did she realize she was shaking. Adrenaline, most likely. She'd just performed frontier surgery on a stranger, a Sioux warrior, in the middle of a thunderstorm, with her daughter sleeping 10 feet away. The warrior's breathing had steadied, though his skin felt hot to the touch. Fever was already setting in. Sarah mixed a dose of willow bark tea, adding herbs she'd learned from an old Mexican woman who'd passed through last summer. Getting him to drink it would be another challenge. She managed to prop him up enough to spoon some of the medicine between his lips. His eyes opened briefly, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Why?" he whispered. It was a good question. Why had she taken in a wounded Sioux warrior when half the territory was terrified of Indian attacks? Why risk her own safety and that of her daughter? "Because you needed help," she said simply. "And I don't let people die if I can prevent it." Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or a reassessment. Then his eyes closed again, and he slipped back into unconsciousness. Sarah sat back, suddenly exhausted. The storm still raged outside, but the immediate crisis had passed. Now came the harder part, keeping him alive through the night and figuring out what to do when morning came. If whoever shot him was looking for him, her cabin would be an obvious place to check. And if word got out that she was harboring a Sioux warrior. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She looked down at her patient, at the strong lines of his face relaxed in unconsciousness. He couldn't have been older than 30, though it was hard to tell. His hair was longer than any white man would wear it, decorated with a single, eagle feather that had somehow survived whatever violence had brought him to her door. Clara stirred again, and Sarah moved to settle her, humming the lullaby that always soothed her back to sleep. When she turned back to the table, the warrior's eyes were open, watching her. There was something unreadable in that gaze. Not hostility, exactly, but a wariness that spoke of too many betrayals. "My daughter," Sarah explained unnecessarily. "She's 6. He nodded slightly, then winced at the movement. "You should not have helped me." "Probably not," Sarah agreed, checking his bandages. "But it's done now. What's your name?" He hesitated, as if giving his name might bind him somehow. "Dakota," he said finally. "I'm Sarah Brennan." She wrung out a cloth in cool water and placed it on his forehead. "And you're safe here, at least for tonight." Dakota's eyes searched her face, looking for the lie, the trap. Finding none, he closed his eyes again. "No one is safe," he murmured. "Not anymore." Sarah wanted to ask what he meant, who had shot him, why he was alone so far from Sioux territory, but the questions could wait. Right now, she had a patient to tend and a storm to weather. She settled into the rocking chair Benjamin had made for her when she was pregnant with Clara, positioning herself where she could watch both her patient and her daughter. The rifle rested across her lap, loaded and ready. If trouble came calling, she'd be prepared. The storm raged on, wind howling like spirits in torment. Somewhere out there, men were hunting. Whether they sought Dakota specifically or just any Indian to blame for their fears, she couldn't know. But they wouldn't take him from her care. Not while he was wounded and helpless, not while she had breath in her body to prevent it. Sarah had learned many things since coming west. How to birth a calf in a blizzard, how to stretch a sack of flour through a hard winter, how to read the sky for weather and the ground for water, how to bury a husband and keep going for the sake of a child. Tonight, she was learning something new, how it felt to stand between a hunted man and his hunters, to choose mercy over fear, to risk everything for a stranger who by all rights should have been her enemy. The war between the Sioux and the encroaching settlers had been brewing for years, getting worse with each mile of railroad track laid across sacred hunting grounds. Sarah had tried to stay neutral, to focus on survival rather than the politics of conquest and resistance. But neutrality was a luxury the frontier rarely allowed. Now she had chosen a side, whether she meant to or not. By saving Dakota's life, by bringing him into her home, she had stepped across an invisible line. There would be consequences. There always were. Lightning illuminated the cabin again, and in that brief flash, Sarah saw Dakota watching her once more. This time, there was something different in his eyes. Not quite trust, that would take longer, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Rest," she told him. "You're going to need your strength." Because she knew with the certainty of someone who had survived too much already that the storm inside her cabin was nothing compared to the one that would break over them when the rain stopped and the world learned what she had done. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, painting thin lines across the cabin floor. Sarah hadn't slept. She'd spent the night in that rocking chair, watching Dakota's chest rise and fall, checking his bandages every hour, cooling his fever with damp cloths. The storm had passed near midnight, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed louder than the thunder. Clara woke with the sun, as she always did, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She froze when she saw the stranger on their table, her small face cycling through confusion and curiosity. "Mama!" Her voice was tiny, uncertain. Sarah rose stiffly, joints protesting after the long vigil. "It's all right, sweetheart. This man was hurt. I'm helping him get better." Clara crept closer, clutching her rag doll. She'd seen injured animals brought in before, Rabbits caught by foxes, birds with broken wings, but never a person, never someone who looked so different from the few visitors they received. "Is he an Indian?" she whispered. "He's Sioux," Sarah confirmed, smoothing her daughter's hair. "His name is Takoda." As if summoned by his name, Takoda's eyes opened. They focused first on Sarah, then shifted to the child. Something softened in his expression, though pain still creased his features. "Good morning," Sarah said, moving to check his wounds. The bandages were soaked through. She'd need to change them soon. "How do you feel?" "Alive," he managed, voice rough. "Your medicine is strong." "My husband was a doctor," Sarah explained, then caught herself. "Was? He passed last summer." Takoda's eyes flickered with understanding. Death was a language everyone on the frontier spoke fluently. Clara had edged closer, fascination overcoming fear. "Does it hurt?" she asked with the directness of childhood. "Yes," Takoda replied simply. "Mama can fix it. She fixed my arm when I fell from the oak tree, and Papa's leg when the horse kicked him. She fixes everything." Sarah felt her throat tighten, if only that were true. She hadn't been able to fix the fever that took Benjamin, hadn't been able to fix the loneliness that followed, hadn't been able to fix the growing pressure from the railroad company that wanted their land. "Clara, go gather the eggs," she instructed gently, "and check on Buttercup. She was spooked by the storm." Clara hesitated, clearly wanting to stay and stare at their unusual guest, but obedience won out. She grabbed her basket and slipped outside, though Sarah caught her peeking back through the window. "She is brave," Takoda observed. "Not afraid. Children see people first. Difference is second," Sarah said, beginning to unwrap his bandages. "We teach them fear." The wounds looked better than she'd expected. No signs of infection yet, though it was early. She worked in silence, cleaning and redressing each injury, while Takoda endured without complaint. "Who shot you?" she asked, finally securing the last bandage. His jaw tightened. "Railroad men. They came to our camp 2 days ago. Said we were on company land." His laugh was bitter. "Land they stole from us with papers and lies." Sarah nodded. She'd heard the stories, seen the survey teams marking territories that had belonged to the tribes for generations. "Were you alone?" "Scouting. My father sent me to watch their movements. I got too close." He tried to sit up, failed, frustration flashing across his face. "I must return. They will think me dead." "You try to ride now. You will be dead," Sarah said, firmly. "Those wounds need at least a week to heal properly. My people will have to wait." She met his gaze steadily. "I didn't save your life just to watch you throw it away." Before he could argue further, hoofbeats sounded in the distance. Sarah's blood chilled. She moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutters. 3 riders approached from the east, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. "Get down!" she hissed, but Takoda had already rolled off the table, suppressing a groan as he crouched behind it. Sarah grabbed a tablecloth and threw it over the blood-stained surface, then picked up her rifle. The riders stopped at her gate. She recognized them immediately. Luther Pike, the railroad's enforcer, flanked by 2 hired guns. Pike had visited twice before, offering to buy her land for a fraction of its worth. Both times she'd refused. Now he dismounted with the confidence of a man who expected to get his way. Sarah stepped onto the porch, rifle casual, but ready. "Mr. Pike, early for a social call." Pike touched his hat brim in mock courtesy. "Mrs. Brennan, we're looking for an Indian, wounded. Horse tracks led this direction before the rain washed them out." "Haven't seen anyone," Sarah replied evenly. "Storm kept me inside all night." Pike's companion, a red-bearded man she'd heard, called Morrison, spat tobacco juice into her flower bed. "Mind if we look around? For your safety, of course. Dangerous savage on the loose." I do mind, Sarah said, her voice hardening. This is private property. Pike's smile was all teeth, no warmth. Now, Mrs. Brennan, we're all neighbors here, just trying to keep everyone safe. Wouldn't want anything to happen to you or your little girl, all alone out here. The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah's finger found the trigger guard. I appreciate your concern, but I can take care of myself. Can you now? Pike stepped closer. Because I heard different. Heard you've been struggling since your husband passed. Hard for a woman alone to keep a place like this running, especially with Indians causing trouble. Clara chose that moment to return, egg basket in hand. She stopped at the sight of the men, instinctively moving closer to her mother. Pike's eyes lit up. Well now, if it isn't little Miss Clara. How are you, sweetheart? Go inside, Sarah commanded. Clara obeyed quickly, sensing the tension. Pike watched her go, then turned back to Sarah. Shame for a child to grow up without proper protection. Dangerous world out here. Why, just last month, the Hendricks family... State your business or leave, Sarah cut him off. Pike's mask of civility cracked slightly. We tracked that Indian. Here, his horse is probably hidden in your barn. Now you can let us search peaceful-like, or we can come back with the sheriff and do this officially. Your choice. Sarah knew Sheriff Briggs was deep in the railroad's pocket. An official search would find Dakota for certain, but letting them look now was equally dangerous. The horse wandered through early this morning, she said, thinking quickly. Spooked, saddled, but riderless. I turned it loose. Figured its owner was beyond help if the saddle was empty in a storm like that. Morrison stepped forward. Convenient story. Truth often is, Sarah replied. Pike studied her for a long moment. You know, Mrs. Brennan, the railroad's offer still stands. Good money for this land, enough to start fresh somewhere safer, somewhere more civilized. I'm not selling. Everyone sells eventually, Pike said. Just a matter of finding the right pressure. His eyes flicked to the cabin where Clara had disappeared. You think on it. We'll be around. They mounted up, but Morrison turned back. That Indian killed 2 of our surveyors, shot them in the back like cowards. If you are hiding him, you're harboring a murderer. Sarah held her ground until they rode off, then sagged against the porch rail. Her hands shook as she lowered the rifle. Inside, Dakota had pulled himself partially upright, leaning against the wall. Fresh blood spotted his bandages. You shouldn't have lied for me, he said. They're lying about you, Sarah countered. You said they came to your camp. That's not the same as ambushing surveyors. Dakota's smile was grim. Truth doesn't matter to men like that, only power. Clara peeked out from the bedroom. Are the bad men gone, Mama? Yes, sweetheart, they're gone. But Sarah knew they'd be back. Pike never gave up on land he wanted, and now he had an excuse to pressure her. Harboring a fugitive, that could cost her everything. She helped Dakota back to the table, checking his reopened wounds. As she worked, he spoke quietly. My father is Chief Mapia. You know this name? Sarah nodded. Everyone in the territory knew of Mapia, the war chief who had united several Sioux bands against the railroad's expansion. He will come looking for me, Dakota continued. When I don't return, he will bring warriors. Will they come here? If they track me as the railroad men did, yes. He caught her wrist gently. You must leave. Take your daughter and go. When my people come, or when those men return, this place will not be safe. Sarah pulled free, anger flashing through her. This is my home. My husband is buried on this land. I won't be driven off by threats from either side. Brave words, Dakota said, but bravery cannot stop bullets. As if to prove his point, a distant gunshot echoed across the valley, then another. Sarah rushed to the window, scanning the horizon. Smoke rose from the direction of the Carlson homestead, 5 miles north. No, she breathed. The Carlsons had 3 children, the youngest barely walking. They'd been good neighbors, sharing preserves and helping with barn raisings. More gunshots, faint but unmistakable. Sarah's mind raced. If the railroad was clearing out homesteaders who wouldn't sell, using the excuse of Indian trouble. "I have to go help," she said, reaching for her medicine bag. Dakota struggled upright. "You cannot. It's too dangerous. Those are my neighbors, my friends." She checked her rifle, grabbed extra ammunition. "Clara, you stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Clara's eyes were wide with fear. "Mama, don't go." Sarah knelt before her daughter, hands on, those small shoulders. "Remember what Papa taught us? Sometimes we have to help others, even when we're scared. I'll be back soon." She looked at Dakota. "Can you protect her if something happens?" "With my life," he promised, and she believed him. Sarah saddled, her mare with practiced efficiency, every second counting. The gunfire had stopped, which worried her more than its continuance would have. She rode hard across the valley, spring grass whipping at her horse's legs. The Carlson homestead came into view, and her heart sank. The barn was fully ablaze, black smoke billowing into the morning sky. The house still stood, but bullet holes pocked its walls. No movement, no sign of life. She approached carefully, rifle ready. "Emma, Jim," she called. "It's Sarah Brennan." Nothing. She dismounted at the front gate, noting the broken fence rails, the trampled garden. The front door hung askew on its hinges. Inside, furniture lay overturned, dishes shattered on the floor, but no bodies, no blood. A child's sob caught her attention. Sarah followed the sound to the root cellar, its heavy doors barred from the outside. She lifted the bar and pulled them open. Emma Carlson huddled in the darkness with her 3 children, all of them covered in dirt and terrified. When she saw Sarah, she broke down completely. "They came at dawn," Emma gasped between sobs. "Said we had to leave. Jim tried to reason with them. They shot him." "Where is he?" Sarah asked gently. "They took him. Said it would look like Indians did it. Said if we told anyone different, they'd come back for the children." Sarah helped them out of the cellar, her mind churning. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated terrorism, designed to clear the valley for the railroad while blaming the tribes. "You can't stay here," she told Emma. "Pack what you can carry. You'll come to my place for now." "But they said they want you scared and silent," Sarah interrupted. "But we're stronger together than alone." It took precious time to gather essentials and load the Carlson wagon. The children were in shock, moving mechanically. As they prepared to leave, the youngest boy tugged on Sarah's skirt. "Will Papa come back?" he asked. Sarah knelt to his level, remembering the same question from Clara months ago. "I don't know," she answered honestly, "but your mama needs you to be brave now. Can you do that?" The boy nodded solemnly, and Sarah's heart broke a little more. They made a small convoy back to Cedar Ridge Farm, the wagon with Emma and the children, Sarah riding guard. Every shadow could hide a threat, every sound might signal attack, but they reached the cabin without incident. Clara unbarred the door at Sarah's call. Her relief at her mother's return shifted to curiosity at their guests. Children were resilient that way, finding normalcy even in chaos. Dakota had managed to dress himself in spare clothes Sarah had left out. Benjamin's shirt and trousers that hung loose on his leaner frame. He stood awkwardly, clearly fighting pain, but determined to appear strong. Emma gasped at the sight of him, gathering her children close. "Sarah, what?" "This is Dakota," Sarah said firmly. "He's injured and under my protection, just as you." "This is his son." The 2 groups stared at each other, the terrified white family and the wounded Sioux warrior, while Sarah stood between them like a bridge across a chasm of fear and mistrust. "Your husband?" Dakota asked Emma quietly. taken, she whispered, by men who want our land. Understanding passed between them, the shared experience of loss at the hands of the same enemy. Takoda nodded slowly. I'm sorry. It was a small moment, but something shifted. Emma's death grip on her children loosened slightly. The oldest Carlson boy stepped forward hesitantly. Are you a chief? He asked Takoda. No, my father is chief. I'm just a warrior. My pa said, warriors are brave. Are you brave? Takoda considered this seriously. Sometimes, when I need to be, like your mother was brave today, protecting you. Emma straightened at this, some strength returning to her spine. She looked at Sarah. What do we do now? Sarah surveyed her crowded cabin, wounded warrior, traumatized family, her own daughter looking to her for answers. Outside, forces gathered like storm clouds, the railroad wanting their land, the Sioux potentially coming for Takoda, law and order corrupted by money and fear. We survive, she said simply. We protect each other, and we tell the truth about what's happening here. They'll kill us all, Emma protested weakly. They'll try, Sarah agreed, but we're not helpless and we're not alone anymore. She caught Takoda's eye, saw his slight nod of agreement. Whatever came next, they would face it together, an unlikely alliance forged by necessity and sealed by shared determination. Outside, vultures circled the smoke from the Carlson barn. Sarah watched them through the window, remembering Benjamin's words. In nature, catastrophe creates opportunity. The prairie fire that destroys also clears ground for new growth. She hadn't understood then. Now, watching her strange household settle into an uneasy truce, she began to see. Sometimes the old ways had to burn before something new could take root. The day wore on, with tense domesticity. Sarah tended wounds, prepared food, organized sleeping arrangements. Clara and the Carlson children slowly began to interact, childhood's resilience overcoming adult fears. Takoda taught the oldest boy to whittle despite his injuries. Emma helped with chores, her hands steadying with purpose. But beneath the surface routine, everyone knew this was merely the quiet before the storm. Pike would return. The Sioux would come looking for Takoda. The truth about the attacks would eventually surface. As evening approached, Sarah found herself on the porch with Takoda. He'd insisted on standing watch, though she could see the pain it cost him. Your father, she began. When he comes, he will see enemies or allies, Takoda finished. Nothing between. And which are we? Takoda was quiet for a long moment. You saved my life. You shelter innocents. You stand against those who would steal and kill. Among my people, these are not the acts of an enemy. But I'm white, a settler on land your people consider theirs. The land belongs to itself, Takoda said. We are all just passing through. The question is, do we pass as locusts consuming everything, or as buffalo living in balance? Sarah thought of Pike and his men, of the railroad carving scars across the prairie, of homesteaders forced to choose between submission and survival. What if the locusts are winning? Then we fight, Takoda said simply, or we die. But we do not surrender what is right. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Sarah tensed, reaching for her rifle, but Takoda placed a hand on her arm. Wait, watch how he rides. The rider moved with fluid grace, horse and human, as one. As he drew closer, Sarah saw the feathers in his hair, the bow across his back. A Sioux scout. One of yours? She asked. Takoda nodded, a mix of relief and concern crossing his face. Red Crow, my father's messenger. He stepped forward, raising his hand in greeting despite the obvious pain it caused. The scout dismounted at the gate, eyes taking in everything, the cabin, the armed white woman, Takoda in settler's clothes. They spoke rapidly in Lakota, gestures telling as much as words. Finally, Dakota turned to Sarah. "My father comes. Tomorrow, with 30 warriors. They believe I am held captive here." Sarah's throat went dry. 30 Sioux warriors, battle-ready and expecting to find their chief's son imprisoned. The misunderstanding could lead to massacre. "Can you tell them? Explain." "Red Crow will carry my words, but..." Dakota hesitated. "My father's anger runs deep. The railroad killed 2 of our young men last week. He seeks war. And if he finds you here recovered and protected, he will question. But he will also see opportunity to strike at the railroad through their allies." Sarah understood. By helping Dakota, she'd inadvertently chosen a side in a conflict she'd tried to avoid. Now, both factions would see her as either asset or enemy. "What do you advise?" she asked. Dakota studied her for a long moment. "Send the woman and children away. Tonight. When my father comes, tell him the truth, that you saved me, that the railroad attacks settlers too. Maybe he will listen. And if he doesn't, then we face what comes, together." Inside, Emma was putting the children to bed, singing softly. Such a normal sound in such an abnormal situation. Sarah made her decision. "We all stay," she said firmly. "Running now would only make us look guilty, and I won't abandon my home or divide our strength." Dakota nodded slowly. "You have the heart of a warrior, Sarah Brennan." "No," she corrected. "I have the heart of a mother, and a mother protects what's hers." As Red Crow rode away with Dakota's message, Sarah began preparations. She had perhaps 18 hours before Chief Mapia arrived. 18 hours to ready her defenses, not against the Sioux necessarily, but against whatever followed their coming, because she knew with cold certainty that Pike was watching. The railroad had spies everywhere. When 30 Sioux warriors rode into the valley, Pike would see his chance to eliminate Dakota, to frame the tribe for more violence, and to finally take the land he coveted. The trap was set. The question was, who would spring it and who would survive? That night, Sarah cleaned every weapon in the house. Emma helped, her hands steady now with purpose. The children slept in a pile like puppies, finding comfort in closeness. Dakota dozed fitfully, fighting fever and pain. Sarah sat by the window, watching the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere out there, forces gathered. By tomorrow night, everything would change. The life she'd built here, the careful neutrality she'd maintained, all of it was ending. But as she looked around the cabin, at the unlikely collection of souls under her protection, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Benjamin died. Not hope exactly, but purpose. The sense of standing for something larger than mere survival. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. The wind picked up near midnight, rattling the shutters like war drums. Sarah checked her rifle one more time, then did something she hadn't done in months. She prayed. Not for safety, that seemed too much to ask. Not for victory. She wasn't even sure what that would look like. She prayed simply for the strength to protect those who needed protecting, and the wisdom to know right from wrong in a world where those lines had blurred beyond recognition. When she opened her eyes, Dakota was watching her from across the room. He nodded once, understanding in his gaze, then closed his eyes again. Warriors recognized each other, even when they fought with different weapons. The night deepened. The wind sang its warnings, and Sarah Brennan sat guard over her strange family, waiting for the dawn that would change everything. Dawn broke blood-red over Black Elk Valley, painting the prairie in shades of warning. Sarah stood on her porch, rifle in hand, watching the horizon where dust clouds gathered like an approaching storm. 30 Sioux warriors were coming, and with them, the moment that would decide everything. Inside the cabin, her unlikely household prepared in their own ways. Emma Carlson had spent the night teaching her children to hide in the root cellar at the first sign of trouble. Dakota, despite his wounds, had dragged himself upright and donned his traditional clothing, the beaded vest Sarah had carefully mended, the feathers that marked his status as the chief's son. He would meet his father as a warrior, not as an invalid. "They're coming," Clara announced from her perch at the window. The child had appointed herself lookout, her young eyes sharp with purpose. Sarah's stomach tightened as the riders emerged from the morning haze. They moved in perfect formation, sunlight glinting off weapons and silver ornaments. At their head rode Chief Mapia, and even from this distance, Sarah could feel the weight of his presence. This was a man who had fought the encroachment of his people's lands for decades, who had buried too many sons to count, whose remaining son now stood wounded in a white woman's cabin. "Everyone stay calm," Sarah instructed, though her own heart raced. "Remember what we discussed. The plan was simple in concept, dangerous in execution. Tell the truth. Show unity. Pray that Mapia's wisdom outweighed his anger." The war party stopped just beyond rifle range, spreading out in a semicircle that blocked any escape route. Chief Mapia rode forward alone, his mount's hooves raising small clouds of dust. He was older than Sarah had expected, perhaps 60 winters, but he sat his horse like a man half that age. His face was carved from the same stone as the valleys, ridges, weathered but unbroken. Sarah stepped off the porch, leaving her rifle behind but keeping her pistol holstered. The gesture was deliberate, showing trust while maintaining prudent caution. Dakota moved to follow, but she held up a hand. "Let me speak first," she said quietly. "He needs to see that you're here by choice." Mapia dismounted with fluid grace, his dark eyes scanning the cabin, the barn, the corrals. When his gaze found Sarah, she felt the full weight of his scrutiny. This was a man who had learned to read truth and lies in the subtlest gestures. "You are the woman who holds my son," he said in accented but clear English. "I am the woman who saved your son," Sarah corrected, meeting his gaze steadily. "He's inside, healing from the railroad men's bullets." Something flickered in Mapia's expression, surprise perhaps, or reassessment. "Bring him out." Sarah turned and nodded. Dakota emerged, moving stiffly but with dignity. The moment father and son locked eyes, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Dakota spoke in rapid Lakota, gesturing to his bandaged wounds, to Sarah, to the cabin. Mapia listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Dakota finished, the chief's attention returned to Sarah. "My son says you risked your life for his, that you lied to his enemies, that you treat him as a guest, not a prisoner. Why would a white woman do this?" Sarah considered her words carefully. "Because I've seen what the railroad does to anyone in their path, red or white. Because your son bled the same color as my husband did. Because being human matters more than being white or Sioux." "Pretty words," Mapia said. "Words are wind." "Then judge my actions," Sarah replied. She gestured to the cabin. "There's another family inside, the Carlsons. The railroad burned them out yesterday, shot the father, threatened the children. They're hiding here just as your son is. We're all targets of the same enemy." Mapia's eyes narrowed. "You would have me believe the railroad attacks its own people." Before Sarah could answer, Emma Carlson stepped onto the porch, her children clustered behind her, fear evident in their faces, but Emma's voice was steady. "They killed my Jim because we wouldn't sell our land," she said. "Said they'd make it look like Indians did it. Said they'd come for my babies if I told the truth." The chief studied her, then looked back at his warriors. Several had dismounted, moving closer to hear the exchange. Sarah recognized the same, anger in their faces that she'd seen in Pike's men, the fury of people pushed too far. "Show me," Mapia commanded. Sarah led him to the Carlson homestead, or what remained of it. The barn's skeleton still smoldered, black beams reaching skyward like accusing fingers. Takoda rode alongside his father, translating Emma's tearful account of the attack. The warriors examined the bullet holes in the house, the tracks of shod, horses, the deliberate nature of the destruction. When they returned to Sarah's cabin, Mapia's demeanor had changed subtly. The suspicion remained, but something else had joined it: consideration. "The railroad wishes to turn us against each other," he said finally. "Red against white, settler against tribe. While we fight, they steal from us all." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly what they want. And tomorrow, when they learn your warriors came here, they'll use it as an excuse for more violence, unless... Unless what? Unless we stand together. Unless we refuse to play their game." Mapia was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Sarah, his son, and the frightened family on the porch. "You propose an alliance between Sioux and settlers?" "I propose survival," Sarah said, "for all of us." The discussion that followed was intense, sometimes heated. Warriors argued in Lakota, while Takoda translated key points. Some wanted immediate attack on the railroad camp. Others counseled caution, retreat to stronger positions. A few suggested taking the settlers hostage, using them as bargaining chips. Through it all, Mapia listened, his weathered face revealing nothing. Finally, he raised a hand for silence. "The woman speaks truth," he announced. "The railroad is the enemy of all who live freely on this land. Today, we choose a different path." He turned to Sarah. "We will help you defend this place. When the railroad men come, and they will come, they will find more than they expected. But this alliance has a price." "Name it," Sarah said. "The truth must be known. Not their lies about savage Indians or helpless settlers. The truth about who burns and kills and steals. You must bear witness to this." Sarah understood. Mapia wasn't just proposing a military alliance, but a political one. He wanted the atrocities exposed, wanted voices that would be heard in places where native testimony was dismissed. "I'll tell anyone who'll listen," she promised, "and I'll make them believe." As if summoned by their agreement, a scout rode in hard from the east. He spoke urgently to Mapia, gesturing toward the railroad construction camp. The chief's face hardened. "They come," he announced. 24 riders armed for war. They will be here within the hour." Sarah felt ice in her veins. Pike wasn't waiting for pretense anymore. He was coming to finish what he'd started, probably planning to blame the violence on the Sioux war party. "How do you want to handle this?" she asked Mapia. The chief smiled for the first time, expression sharp as a blade. "We give them what they expect to see, but not what they expect to face." The plan came together with military precision. Warriors concealed themselves around the homestead, in the barn loft, behind the woodshed, along the creek bed. From a distance, only a few would be visible, apparently threatening the cabin. The Carlson family was secured in the root cellar, with 2 braves as guards. Clara joined them over Sarah's protests. "She's already lost her father," Emma argued. "She doesn't need to see more killing." Sarah relented, though it tore at her. To be separated from her daughter at such a moment. She took position at the front window, rifle ready. Beside her, Takoda checked his weapons, a Winchester rifle borrowed from Sarah's collection and his traditional bow. "You should be resting," she told him. "I should be many things," he replied. "But what I am is a warrior defending his friends." The word hung between them. Friends. It felt both inadequate and exactly right. Mapia positioned himself prominently on the porch, 5 warriors flanking him in clear sight. To Pike's eyes, it would look like a typical raiding party holding the cabin hostage. He wouldn't see the 20 additional warriors hidden and waiting. They heard Pike's men before they saw them. The thunder of hooves, the jingle of tack, the rough voices of men working themselves up for violence. They crested the ridge in a loose formation, Pike at the center with Morrison beside him. Sarah recognized others, hired guns and railroad security, men who'd chosen gold over conscience. They pulled up just outside effective rifle range, milling, in apparent confusion at the sight of the Sioux warriors. Pike rode forward, and Sarah could see his mind working, trying to piece together this unexpected scene. Well, he called out. Looks like we arrived just in time. These savages giving you trouble, Mrs. Brennan? Sarah stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled in her arms. No trouble at all, Mr. Pike. Chief Mapia and I were just discussing our mutual interests. Pike's face cycled through emotions. Confusion, suspicion, then understanding, followed by ugly rage. You've thrown in with them, against your own kind. I've thrown in with people who don't burn families out of their homes, Sarah replied evenly. People who don't murder farmers and blame it on others. People like the Carlsons, who you tried to destroy yesterday. I don't know what lies they've been feeding you. The only lies here are yours, Dakota interrupted, appearing in the doorway. We know what you did. We know what you planned to blame on us. Pike's hand moved toward his gun. That's the murderer right there. He killed 2 of my men. After you attacked his camp, Sarah shot back. After you've been killing and burning across this valley. It ends now, Pike. The railroad man's face twisted with fury. You're making a big mistake, lady. These animals will turn on you the moment it suits them. And when they do, don't expect any help from civilized folk. Civilized? Sarah laughed bitterly. Is that what you call terrorizing families? Murdering farmers? Framing innocent people for your crimes? Pike's men were growing restless, hands drifting toward weapons, the tension stretched like a bowstring, ready to snap. Sarah saw Morrison lean toward Pike, whispering urgently. She caught fragments. Too many, and not what we planned. But Pike was beyond caution now. His scheme was unraveling, his control of the narrative slipping away. In his mind, there was only one solution: eliminate all witnesses. Take them, he snarled. The world exploded into chaos. Pike's men charged forward, guns blazing. The visible Sioux warriors returned fire while diving for cover. But as the attackers committed to their assault, Mapia's hidden forces revealed themselves. Warriors rose from concealment like ghosts becoming solid, their war cries splitting the air. Arrows whistled alongside bullets. Pike's confident charge faltered as his men suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outflanked. Sarah fired from the window, picking her targets carefully. Beside her, Dakota worked his rifle with grim efficiency despite his wounds. On the porch, Mapia stood calmly in the storm of lead, directing his warriors with hand signals, seemingly untouchable. The battle was brief, but vicious. Pike's men, expecting easy victory against a handful of warriors and settlers, found themselves in a tactical nightmare. Caught in crossfire, facing opponents who knew the terrain intimately, they broke and ran within minutes. Morrison went down first, clutching his shoulder where one of Sarah's bullets had found its mark. Another man fell from his horse, brought down by an arrow. 3 more threw down their weapons and raised their hands, preferring surrender to slaughter. Pike himself, wheeling his horse in circles and firing wildly, seemed to bear a charmed life until Dakota's shot took off his hat. The railroad man's courage evaporated. He spurred his horse east, abandoning his men, fleeing toward the safety of the construction camp. Let him go, Mapia commanded. As several warriors moved to pursue, he will spread word of what happened here. Fear serves our purpose now. The aftermath was eerily quiet. Gunsmoke drifted across the yard like morning fog. Several of Pike's men lay groaning in the dust, wounded but alive. The rest had scattered, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the distance. Sarah emerged from the cabin, her hands shaking now, that the immediate danger had passed. She surveyed the battlefield, her front yard turned into a war zone, blood soaking into soil she'd tended with such care. Is it over? She asked Mahpia. This battle, yes. The war. The chief shook his head. Pike will return with more men, the army perhaps. They will say we massacred innocent railroad workers. Then we need to move fast, Sarah decided. Get our version out first. Emma, bring out the children. They need to see we're all safe. As the Carlson family emerged, blinking in the sunlight, Sarah felt the weight of what had just occurred. Lines had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. She was no longer a neutral homesteader trying to survive. She was an active combatant in a war she'd tried to avoid. But looking around at the faces surrounding her, Takoda, wounded but victorious, Mahpia, grim but approving, Emma, holding her children with fierce protectiveness, the Sioux warriors, who had risked their lives for strangers. She knew she'd chosen the right side. What happens now? Emma asked, voicing everyone's thoughts. Sarah looked to Mahpia, acknowledging his leadership in this strange alliance. The chief considered for a moment, then spoke. Now we prepare for the storm they'll bring. We gather more allies, other homesteaders the railroad has wronged, tribes who have suffered their violence. We document everything, spread the truth faster than they can spread their lies. He turned to Sarah. You said you would bear witness. That time has come. You must ride to the territorial capital, speak to whoever will listen. My son will go, with you, along with the Carlson woman. 3 voices are harder to silence than one. Sarah nodded, understanding the strategy. While she and the other witnesses sought legal remedies, Mahpia would prepare for the physical conflict to come. It was a 2-front war, one of words and one of weapons. I'll need to make arrangements for Clara, she began, but Mahpia held up a hand. The child stays with us. My people will protect her as our own. She is safest where Pike cannot reach. Her to use against you. The thought of leaving Clara terrified Sarah, but the logic was sound. Pike had already threatened her daughter once. He wouldn't hesitate to use her as leverage. I need to say goodbye to her, Sarah said, her voice thick. Of course. We have time. Pike will need to regroup, spin his story, gather more men. We have perhaps 3 days before he moves again. As Sarah walked toward the root cellar to retrieve her daughter, Takoda fell into step beside her. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. You fought well, he said quietly. I fought desperate, Sarah corrected. There's a difference. Sometimes they are the same. He paused, seeming to struggle with words. What you did today, most would not have done. You had every reason to side with your own people. Sarah stopped, facing him. You are my people. Emma and her children are my people. Anyone who stands against men like Pike is my people. Race, tribe, none of that matters when survival is at stake. Takoda studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My father was right to trust you. I was right to trust you. They found Clara in the root cellar, comforting the youngest Carlson boy. The child looked up as her mother descended the ladder, her face brightening with relief. Mama, is it safe now? Sarah gathered her daughter into her arms, breathing, in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her small body. It's safe for now, sweetheart, but I need to tell you something important. She explained as simply as she could that she needed to go away for a little while, to tell important people about what had happened, that Clara would stay with Chief Mahpia's people, who would keep her safe. Like an adventure? Clara asked, her voice small but brave. Exactly like an adventure, Sarah agreed, fighting back tears. And when I come back, I'll have stories to tell you. As the sun climbed higher, the strange alliance set about its work. The wounded were tended, including several of Pike's men who had surrendered. Sarah was surprised to see the Sioux warriors treating enemy wounded with the same care they showed. Their own. Honor demands it, Mahpia explained when she commented. How we treat defeated enemies shows who we truly are. The bodies of the two men killed in the fighting were wrapped respectfully to be returned to the railroad camp with a message that this was self-defense, not massacre, and that witnesses would testify to the truth. By midday, scouts reported no immediate movement from the railroad camp. Pike was likely spinning his version of events, painting himself as a hero who'd barely escaped a savage ambush. But he'd also be wary now, knowing the Sioux and settlers had united against him. Sarah used the time to prepare for the journey ahead. She packed her husband's journals, which documented earlier railroad abuses. She gathered affidavits from Emma about the attack on their homestead. She even convinced one of the surrendered railroad men, a young hand named Tom Briggs, to write out what he'd witnessed. "Pike told us we were riding to rescue white women from Indians," Briggs admitted, his arm in a sling from a bullet graze. "Said the savages had taken over the Brennan place, but that ain't what happened, and I won't lie for him anymore." As evening approached, Sarah found herself standing at her husband's grave. The wooden marker had weathered but still stood straight. She knelt beside it, her hand on the earth. "I hope you'd understand, Benjamin," she whispered. "I know you always said to stay neutral, to focus on our own survival. But sometimes neutrality is just another word for cowardice. Sometimes you have to choose a side, even if it costs everything." The wind stirred the grass around the grave, and for a moment, Sarah imagined she heard Benjamin's voice on the breeze. Not words exactly, but a feeling of approval, of understanding. When she rose, Dakota was waiting nearby, having approached silently despite his injuries. "We will protect this place while you're gone," he said. "Your husband's grave, your home. They will be here when you return." "If I return," Sarah said realistically, "Pike has powerful friends. The railroad owns judges, politicians, newspapers. They might arrest me the moment I start telling the truth. Then I will break you out of jail," Dakota said matter-of-factly, "and we will find another way to fight." Sarah smiled despite everything. "You make it sound simple." "Right and wrong are simple," Dakota replied. "It's people who make them complicated." That night, they held a council of war. Mapia laid out the strategy in detail. Sarah, Dakota, and Emma would leave at dawn, taking 3 of the fastest horses. They'd follow little-known trails to avoid railroad patrols, reaching the territorial capital in 2 days of hard riding. Meanwhile, Mapia would send messengers to other Sioux bands and to sympathetic homesteaders. He'd fortify several defensive positions across the valley, creating a network of resistance that couldn't be easily swept aside. "The railroad thinks in straight lines," he explained, drawing maps in the dirt. "They will expect us to fort up in one place, make one stand. Instead, we will be like water, flowing around their strength, striking where they are weak." It was good strategy, Sarah recognized. The railroad's power came from its wealth and political connections, but it was vulnerable in other ways. Its construction depended on supply lines that could be disrupted. Its investors needed the appearance of progress and profit. Too much violence, too much negative attention, and those investors might reconsider. "We don't have to defeat them militarily," she said, understanding. "We just have to make their victory too expensive." Mapia smiled approvingly. "You think like a warrior. Perhaps there is hope for this alliance after all." The conversation continued late into the night, plans refined and contingencies discussed. But eventually, exhaustion claimed them all. Sarah bedded down in her own home for what might be the last time. Clara curled against her side. "Mama," the child whispered in the darkness, "will everyone be okay?" Sarah stroked her daughter's hair, wishing she could offer guarantees. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to try our very best to make things right. Like Papa used to say, about standing up for what's good?" "Exactly like that," Sarah agreed, her throat tight with emotion. She stayed awake long after. Clara's breathing evened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the path that had led her here. A week ago, she'd been a widow trying to scratch out a living on the frontier. Now she was a revolutionary, allied with hereditary enemies against the march of what some called progress. Outside, she could hear the low voices of Sioux warriors, standing watch, protecting her home as if it were their own. The sound should have been alarming. Instead, it was oddly comforting. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. The journey to the capital would be perilous. Even if they arrived safely, convincing authorities to listen to their version of events would be an uphill battle. Pike and the railroad had money, influence, and the weight of racial prejudice on their side. But they also had truth. And sometimes, Sarah reflected, truth could be the most powerful weapon of all. The moon traced its path across the sky, and gradually Sarah's racing thoughts settled. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. For Clara, for the Carlsons, for Dakota and his people, for all the victims of the railroad's greed. She had chosen her side. Now she would fight for it with everything she had. As dawn approached, bringing with it the beginning of a journey that would reshape the valley's future, Sarah Brennan finally slept. In her dreams, she rode across an endless prairie where no fences marked the land, where buffalo still roamed in vast herds, where people of all colors lived without fear. It was a dream worth fighting for. The territorial capital of Cheyenne bustled with a peculiar energy that morning, part frontier roughness, part political ambition. Sarah Brennan adjusted her travel-worn dress as she stood before the imposing governor's mansion, flanked by Dakota and Emma Carlson. They'd ridden hard for 2 days, following game trails and creek beds to avoid railroad patrols. And now, the moment of truth had arrived. "Remember," Sarah said quietly, "we tell the truth, simply and clearly. No embellishment, no dramatics. The facts are dramatic enough." Dakota nodded, his hand unconsciously moving to his still healing wounds. He'd traded his traditional garments for a simple cotton shirt and vest, less to blend in than to avoid, giving their opponents easy ammunition about wild Indians. Emma clutched a leather portfolio containing affidavits, photographs, and evidence of the railroad's crimes. The governor's secretary, a pinch-faced man named Whitmore, had kept them waiting for 3 hours already. Sarah suspected it was deliberate, a way to wear down their resolve, but she'd waited out worse things than bureaucratic rudeness. Finally, the heavy oak doors opened. "Governor Moonlight will see you now," Whitmore announced with barely concealed disdain. They entered a room that spoke of power and pretension. Heavy furniture, oil paintings of stern-faced men, a massive desk behind which sat Governor Thomas Moonlight himself. He was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 45, with shrewd eyes that took in everything at once. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, rising politely, but not warmly, "I understand you have urgent business regarding the situation in Black Elk Valley." Sarah stepped forward. "Governor, we've come to report systematic violence against homesteaders by the Pacific Railroad Company, violence they're attempting to blame on the Sioux Nation." Moonlight's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, interest or concern. Sarah couldn't tell which. "Those are serious allegations. Please, sit. Tell me everything." For the next hour, they laid out their case. Sarah spoke of Pike's threats, the attack on her homestead, the attempted murder of Dakota. Emma, voice breaking, described the burning of her farm, her husband's shooting, the threats against her children. Dakota, when his turn came, spoke with quiet dignity about the railroad's encroachment on treaty lands, the unprovoked attacks on Sioux camps, the deliberate strategy of inciting racial warfare. Through it all, Governor Moonlight listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You have evidence to support these claims?" Emma opened the portfolio, spreading documents across the governor's desk, sworn statements from the surrendered railroad men, photographic plates showing bullet holes and burn patterns inconsistent with Indian attacks, a map marking the systematic pattern of violence along the proposed rail route. Moonlight studied each piece carefully. "This is compelling," he admitted, "but you must understand my position. The Pacific Railroad has significant investment in this territory. They employ hundreds of men, bring commerce and connection to isolated communities. They bring death and theft," Dakota interrupted, his control finally slipping. "They tear apart the land, poison the streams, slaughter anyone in their path." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm, and he fell silent, though his jaw remained clenched. "Governor," Sarah said carefully, "we understand the railroad's importance. We're not asking you to stop progress. We're asking you to stop murder, to investigate these crimes properly, to protect all citizens of this territory, regardless of race." Moonlight stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. The railroad companies have powerful friends in Washington, senators, congressmen, even members of the president's cabinet. Going against them would require irrefutable proof and considerable political courage. "We have the proof," Emma said. "Do you have the courage?" The governor turned, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "Mrs. Carlson, you'd be surprised what motivates a politician. Public opinion, for instance. The newspapers have been full of stories about Indian depredations, settler fears, the need for military intervention. But if another narrative emerged, one of corporate violence, of Americans terrorizing Americans, of an unholy alliance between greed and brutality, well, that might shift public sentiment considerably." Sarah began to understand. "You want us to go public, to tell our story to the newspapers?" "I can't suggest such a thing officially," Moonlight said carefully, "but if such information were to become widely known, if public outrage were to build, it would certainly make it easier for my office to take appropriate action." As if on cue, Whitmore knocked and entered. "Governor Marshall Corrigan is here. He says it's urgent." Sarah's blood chilled as a tall man in a black coat entered, his marshal's badge gleaming. His eyes swept the room, lingering on Dakota with undisguised hostility. "Governor," Corrigan said, "I've received word of an Indian uprising in Black Elk Valley. A war party attacked peaceful railroad workers, killing 2 and wounding several others. The leader of this war party," he pointed at Dakota, "is sitting right here in your office." "That's a lie," Sarah protested, but Corrigan continued over her. "I have warrants for the arrest of this savage and these women for aiding and abetting, murder, inciting rebellion, and conspiracy against the lawful interests of the United States government." The room erupted in argument. Emma clutched her children's photographs, tears streaming. Dakota tensed, ready to fight. Sarah felt the walls closing in, their carefully constructed case crumbling under the weight of official authority. Then, Governor Moonlight did something unexpected. He laughed. "Marshal Corrigan," he said, his voice dripping with false concern, "you seem to have been misinformed. These people are here under my protection, providing testimony in an official territorial investigation into corporate malfeasance and violence. Any attempt to arrest them would be interference with executive authority." Corrigan's face reddened. "Governor, with all due respect." "Furthermore," Moonlight continued, walking to his desk and pulling out an official seal, "I'm hereby appointing Mrs. Brennan as Special Territorial Investigator, with full authority to gather evidence and testimony regarding violence in Black Elk Valley. Mr. Dakota and Mrs. Carlson are material witnesses under territorial protection." He stamped several documents with practiced efficiency, handing them to Sarah. "These should provide you with the authority you need. I suggest you return to Black Elk Valley immediately and conduct a thorough investigation. I'll expect a full report within 2 weeks." Corrigan stood stunned, his planned arrest derailed by political maneuvering he hadn't anticipated. "Governor, the railroad company won't stand for this interference." "The railroad company," Moonlight said coldly, "operates in this territory at the pleasure of its government and its people. They would do well to remember that." As they left the governor's mansion, Sarah's mind raced. Moonlight had bought them time and given them official status, but she understood the game being played. He was using them to gauge public reaction, to test the political winds before committing himself fully. "We need to move fast," she told the others. "These papers give us authority, but Pike won't care about legal niceties. We need to get our story out before he can silence us permanently." They split up. Emma went to the largest newspaper in Cheyenne, the Daily Sun Leader, with their evidence and her heartbreaking personal account. Dakota sought out other Sioux who lived on the edges of the city, spreading word through native networks. Sarah visited 3 more newspapers and sent telegrams to papers in Denver, San Francisco, and even New York. By evening, the story was breaking across the territory. "Railroad terror in Black Elk Valley," screamed the Sun Leader's evening edition. "Settlers and Sioux unite against corporate violence," proclaimed the Rocky Mountain News. In the telegraph office, Sarah received word from Mapia. The chief had fortified several positions throughout the valley. More homesteaders had joined their alliance, driven by fear of the railroad's brutality. Even some former railroad workers, disgusted by Pike's methods, had switched sides. But the news wasn't all good. Pike had gathered a force of nearly 100 men, hired guns, corrupt lawmen and railroad security. They were preparing to sweep through the valley, crushing all resistance. The army had been alerted, though it was unclear which side they would support. "We ride at dawn," Sarah decided. "With these official papers and the story now public, we have a chance to prevent a massacre. But we need to be there when it starts." That night, as they prepared for the dangerous journey back, Sarah found herself alone with Dakota on the boarding house porch. The streets of Cheyenne were quiet, but tension hung in the air like smoke before a prairie fire. "Your father was right to send you with us," Sarah said. "Your presence, your testimony, it made the difference. People couldn't dismiss this as just settler complaints when they saw you standing with us." Dakota was quiet for a moment. "My people have a saying, 'The enemy of my enemy is my friend.' I thought that's all this was. But? He turned to face her, his dark eyes serious. "You risked everything for strangers, for people your kind typically fear and hate. That's not alliance. That's honor." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Dakota said firmly, "they wouldn't. I've seen what fear does to people, how it twists them. You chose compassion over fear. That's rare." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge over the distant mountains. Tomorrow would bring violence, possibly death. But tonight, in this quiet moment, something profound had shifted between them, and between their peoples. The return journey to Black Elk Valley took on the quality of a forced march. They pushed their horses hard, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Sarah's official papers got them past 2 railroad checkpoints, though she could see the hatred in the guards' eyes as they waved them through. On the second day, they met refugees fleeing the valley, homesteader families with haunted eyes and meager possessions piled in wagons. The stories they told were grim. Pike's forces had begun their sweep, burning out anyone suspected of supporting the Sioux alliance. But Mapia's warriors were fighting back, using hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the railroad's superior numbers. "It's war," one farmer told them. "Real war. And Pike's telling everyone the Indians started it, that they're massacring white folks left and right. Sarah showed him the newspapers from Cheyenne. The man's eyes widened as he read. This changes things. Folk need to know the truth. Spread the word, Sarah urged. Tell everyone you meet. The truth is our best weapon now. They reached the outskirts of Black Elk Valley just as the sun touched the western horizon. Smoke columns rose from several directions, some from burning homesteads, others from Mapia's signal fires. The sound of distant gunfire echoed across the prairie. They made their way carefully to Cedar Ridge Farm, finding it transformed into a military camp. Sioux warriors and armed homesteaders worked side by side, preparing defenses. Women tended wounded in the barn, children huddled in the root cellar, Clara among them. Sarah barely had time to embrace her daughter before Mahpia approached, his face grave. You return at the turning point, he said. Pike masses his forces at Coulter's Crossing. Tomorrow he plans to sweep through the valley with overwhelming force. We cannot match his numbers in open battle. You won't have to, Sarah said, producing the governor's papers and the newspapers. Look. Mahpia studied the documents, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest to something like hope. The white chief in Cheyenne supports us? Conditionally, Sarah admitted, but Pike doesn't know that yet. More importantly, the story is out. Newspapers across the territory are carrying it. Public opinion is turning. If we can delay Pike, prevent a massacre, the political pressure will build until even his wealthy backers can't protect him. Plans formed quickly. Using her new authority as territorial investigator, Sarah would ride directly into Pike's camp. Under flag of truce, she would demand he cease operations pending official investigation. It was dangerous. Pike might simply shoot her and claim she was killed in crossfire, but it might buy precious time. I'll go with you, Dakota said immediately. And I, added Emma, surprising everyone. They killed my husband. They won't kill me without the whole territory knowing why. At dawn, the three rode toward Coulter's Crossing. Sarah carried the governor's documents, the newspapers, and a white flag. Her hands were steady on the reins, but her heart hammered. Against her ribs, this was the moment everything had built toward. Pike's camp sprawled across the crossing like a small town. Tents, supply wagons, cook fires, and armed men everywhere. Sentries stopped them at the perimeter, roughly searching them for weapons before escorting them to the command tent. Luther Pike stood over a map table, surrounded by his lieutenants. When he saw Sarah, his face twisted with rage. You dare show your face here after consorting with savages, after spreading lies in the newspapers? Sarah dismounted calmly, keeping her voice level. I come with the authority of Governor Moonlight and the territory of Wyoming. You are hereby ordered to cease all operations pending official investigation into allegations of violence against citizens. She produced the documents, laying them on Pike's table. He glanced at them, then laughed harshly. Papers? You think papers will stop progress? The railroad owns this territory, girl. We are the law here. Not anymore, Sarah replied. She pulled out the newspapers, spreading them where his men could see. The whole country knows what you've been doing. Burning. Farms killing settlers, blaming the Sioux. It's over, Pike. She could see uncertainty creeping into the faces of Pike's men. Many were just hired guns, loyal to money rather than cause. If public opinion turned against the railroad, if criminal charges became possible, Pike saw it too. His hand dropped to his pistol. You're under arrest for sedition, conspiracy, and murder. Men, seize them. But something unexpected happened. His men hesitated. In that moment of doubt, hoofbeats thundered from the east. A cavalry unit swept into camp, blue uniforms bright in the morning sun. At their head rode Captain William Forsyth, whom Sarah recognized from Fort Laramie. Mr. Pike, Forsyth called out, reining up sharply. By order of General Crook and the Department of the Platte, all railroad security operations in this region are suspended immediately. Any further violence against citizens, white or native, will be treated as insurrection against the United States government. Pike's face went white. You can't. The railroad has contracts, agreements, which don't supersede federal authority, Forsyth replied coldly. He turned to Sarah. Mrs. Brennan, I'm to escort you safely back to the territorial capital. Your investigation has the full backing of the army. The transformation was remarkable. Pike's army began dissolving before their eyes. Hired guns calculated their chances and didn't like the odds. Former railroad workers remembered grievances against their employers. Within an hour, what had been an overwhelming force became a demoralized rabble. Pike himself was arrested, along with Morrison and several others directly implicated in the violence. As soldiers led him away in chains, he shot Sarah a look of pure venom. This isn't over, he snarled. The railroad has resources you can't imagine. We'll bury you in court, destroy your reputation, make sure you never... Mr. Pike, Captain, Forsyth interrupted, I'd save your words for your lawyer. You'll need them. The ride back to Cedar Ridge Farm felt surreal. Sarah had prepared for battle, for death even. Instead, they'd won through paperwork and public pressure, though she knew the bravery of Mapia's warriors had bought the time needed for those tools to work. The celebration that night was unlike anything the valley had seen. Sioux and settlers mingled freely, sharing food, stories, and cautious hope. Mapia and Sarah were seated side by side at the head table, a symbol of the alliance that had saved them all. This is not the end, Mapia warned quietly. The railroad will return, with different faces but the same hunger. I know, Sarah replied, but now we know we can fight them, together. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself walking with Dakota along the creek behind her cabin. The same creek where this had all begun, where she'd found him bleeding. In the storm. What will you do now? She asked. My father speaks of a new treaty, one that acknowledges both our people's rights to this land. I will help him negotiate it. And you? Sarah considered. The governor wants me to continue as an investigator, says the territory needs someone who understands both sides, who can help prevent future conflicts. You would be good at that, Dakota said. Then more quietly, though I had hoped. What? He stopped walking, turning to face her. My people believe that crisis reveals truth. In our crisis, I saw your true heart. It calls to mine. Sarah's breath caught. She'd felt it too. The connection that had grown between them, deeper than alliance, stronger than friendship. But the reality of their different worlds loomed large. Dakota, the differences between us are real, he agreed. But so is this. He reached out, gently taking her hand. I do not ask for answers tonight, only that you consider possibilities. She squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses from bow and rein, the warmth of his touch. I will. They stood there as the stars emerged, two people from different worlds who had found common ground in the most unlikely circumstances. Behind them, the celebration continued, Sioux drums blending with fiddle music, children of both races playing together, warriors and farmers sharing drinks and stories. It was not perfect harmony. There would be challenges ahead, conflicts to resolve, prejudices to overcome. But it was a beginning. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the territorial courthouse, presenting her final report on the Black Elk Valley incident. The investigation had spread far beyond Pike's immediate crimes, revealing a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of the railroad companies. Pike himself had been convicted of murder and conspiracy, sentenced to 20 years in prison. Several railroad executives faced federal charges. Most importantly, new regulations governed railroad expansion, requiring negotiation and fair compensation for all affected parties. The Sioux had secured better treaty terms, protecting sacred lands while allowing limited railroad development in other areas. Some called it compromise, others called it wisdom. Sarah had been offered positions in Washington, opportunities to shape federal policy. She'd turned them all down. Her place was in Black Elk Valley, helping to build the fragile peace between peoples. As she left the courthouse, she found Dakota waiting with 2 horses. He wore a mix of traditional and modern clothing now, as did she, a visual symbol of the blending of worlds they'd come to represent. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Home, Cedar Ridge Farm, had become something more than her solitary homestead. It was a meeting place, a school where children of both races learned together, a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Clara had embraced her new life with the adaptability of youth. She spoke basic Lakota now, played with Sioux children as easily as with the Carlson kids. The sight of her braiding flowers with little dear, Mapia's granddaughter, never failed to make Sarah's heart swell. They rode out of Cheyenne as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The prairie stretched before them, vast and unchanged, despite all the human drama it had witnessed. "Do you ever regret it?" Dakota asked as they camped that night. "The simple life you had before?" Sarah considered, stirring the fire with a stick. "It wasn't simple, just isolated. I thought staying neutral would keep us safe, but safety without purpose is just another kind of death." She looked across the fire at him. This man who'd entered her life as a wounded stranger and become so much more. They hadn't made any formal commitments yet, mindful of the complexities their relationship faced. But the understanding between them grew daily, a quiet certainty that needed no words. "Besides," she added with a smile, "my life is far from simple now." That was certainly true. As territorial investigator and unofficial mediator, she dealt with disputes between settlers and tribes, negotiated land agreements, investigated crimes that crossed cultural boundaries. It was challenging work, often dangerous, always important, but she didn't do it alone. Dakota rode with her often, his knowledge of tribal ways invaluable, his presence a bridge between worlds. Together, they were building something new, not just a personal relationship, but a model for how different peoples could coexist. The next morning brought them within sight of Black Elk Valley. Sarah reined up at their favorite overlook, surveying the land she'd fought so hard to protect. New homesteads dotted the valley, but thoughtfully placed, leaving corridors for wildlife and respecting sacred sites. The railroad had come through eventually, but on terms that acknowledged everyone's rights. "It's not perfect," she said. "Nothing is," Dakota replied, "but it's better than what might have been." They rode down into the valley as the sun climbed higher, heading home. Behind them, their shadows merged on the ground, 2 distinct forms creating one shape, moving forward together into whatever future awaited. The war for Black Elk Valley was over. The work of peace had just begun. But Sarah Brennan, who had once stood alone against the storm, now faced that work with hope. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. That enemies could become allies when they recognized their common humanity. That love could bridge the deepest divides. As they approached Cedar Ridge Farm, Clara came running out to meet them, braids flying, face bright with joy. Behind her, Emma Carlson emerged from the cabin, her children playing in the yard. Smoke rose from the chimney. Someone was already preparing the evening meal. This was her family now, not the one she'd planned, but the one she'd chosen. Built from crisis, strengthened by struggle, bound by something deeper than blood. Sarah dismounted and swept Clara into her arms, feeling Dakota's presence beside her, hearing the laughter of children and the whisper of wind through prairie grass. The sun was warm on her face, the earth solid beneath her feet. She was home, and in this place where violence had threatened to tear everything apart, they were building something new. One relationship, one understanding, one day at a time. It wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, conflicts, moments of doubt, but they would face them together. The prairie stretched endless around them, and the future opened wide with possibility. Whatever storms lay ahead, Sarah Brennan knew she wouldn't weather them alone. She had found her place, her purpose, and her people. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into friends. Not from standing apart, but from standing together. The wind carried the scent of sage and coming rain, of dinner cooking and children playing. Sarah breathed it in deeply, then turned toward her cabin, their cabin, where a new chapter of life waited to be written. Behind her, the sun painted the valley in shades of gold, blessing the land where blood had been shed and understanding had been born. It was a good day to be alive, a good place to call home, a good time to believe. In tomorrow, the story of Black Elk Valley would be told for generations. A tale of courage and compassion, of bridges built across the deepest divides. But for Sarah, Dakota, and all who dwelt there now, it was simply life, complex, challenging, and filled with hope. As they walked toward the cabin together, the prairie wind whispered its eternal song, and the earth continued its ancient turning, carrying them all forward into whatever tomorrow might bring. The morning mist clung to Black Elk Valley like a shroud as Sarah Brennan stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the sun paint the landscape in hues of amber and rose. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at Coulter's Crossing. 6 months since the alliance between settlers and Sioux had rewritten the rules of frontier survival. The valley below bore the scars of conflict, blackened foundations where homes once stood, fresh graves dotting the hillsides, but also signs of renewal that spoke to the resilience of both land and people. Beside her, Dakota adjusted the telescope. They used to monitor the valley's approaches. His wounds had healed, leaving only faint lines across his shoulder and back, but the experience had marked him in deeper ways. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and chosen life, who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in its better angels. "Riders coming from the east," he announced, lowering the telescope. "Government men, by their look. Perhaps 20. Sarah nodded, unsurprised. They'd been expecting this visit for weeks. The Territorial Commission investigating the railroad violence had finally prepared its report, and today they would deliver their findings. Everything, the future of the valley, the validity of their alliance, the possibility of lasting peace, hinged on what those men carried in their leather portfolios. They mounted their horses and rode down to Cedar Ridge Farm, where the delegation would arrive within the hour. The homestead had transformed dramatically since that night when Sarah had first found Dakota bleeding in her dooryard. What had once been a solitary widow's holding was now the unofficial capital of their experimental community. New buildings flanked the original cabin, a larger barn, a smokehouse, additional dwellings for the families who had joined them. Gardens sprawled across formerly empty fields, tended by both native and settler hands. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolhouse Emma Carlson had established, where young minds learned without the poison of inherited hatred. Chief Mapia waited on the porch, his weathered face impassive as always, but his eyes alert for any sign of trouble. The months had aged him, not in weakness, but in the way that great responsibility carves its mark on leaders. He had risked everything on this alliance, staking his people's future on the belief that cooperation could triumph over conquest. "They come with many guns," he observed as Sarah and Dakota dismounted. Protocol, Sarah replied, though she shared his wariness. The commission includes military officers. They won't risk appearing vulnerable. Or perhaps they expect us to resist their judgment, Dakota added grimly. Inside the cabin, others had gathered. Emma Carlson, whose testimony had swayed public opinion. Several homesteaders who had suffered under the railroad's violence, Red Crow and other Sioux warriors who served as bridges between the traditional bands and this new community. The mixture of cultures that had once seemed impossible now felt natural, even necessary. Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of cups. At 6 years old, she moved between worlds with the effortless grace of childhood, chattering in English to the Carlson children one moment and practicing her Lakota with Mapia's grandchildren the next. She represented what they were all fighting for, a future where such fluid identity wasn't remarkable, but simply human. The government delegation arrived precisely at noon, their horses kicking up dust as they filed through the gate. Sarah recognized several faces: Colonel Patterson from Fort Laramie, Judge Whitfield from the Territorial Court, various officials and clerks. But the man who commanded attention was Jackson Reed, the federal commissioner appointed to lead the investigation. Reed was a tall, austere figure with silver hair and penetrating gray eyes. His reputation preceded him: incorruptible, methodical, ruthlessly fair. The railroad companies had tried to bribe him, threaten him, and circumvent him. All had failed. He dismounted with military precision and approached the porch where Sarah and Mapia waited. "Mrs. Brennan, Chief Mapia," he said, removing his hat, "I appreciate your hospitality. Shall we proceed with the formal reading of the commission's findings?" They gathered in the main room, which had been cleared for the occasion. Reed's assistants unpacked documents while the principals took their seats. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Months of investigation, testimony, and political maneuvering had led to this moment. Reed stood, holding a bound report that represented the official government position on the Black Elk Valley conflict. He cleared his throat and began to read. After extensive investigation into the events of April through September 1874 in the Black Elk Valley region of Wyoming Territory, this commission finds as follows. First, that agents of the Pacific Railroad Company, acting under the direction of Luther Pike and with the knowledge of senior company officials, did engage in systematic violence against lawful homesteaders for the purpose of acquiring land rights without proper compensation. Second, that these same agents deliberately attempted to incite racial warfare between white settlers and members of the Sioux Nation, with the intention of using such conflict to justify military intervention favorable to railroad interests. Third, that the alliance formed between certain homesteaders and the Sioux bands under Chief Mapia constituted a legitimate act of self-defense against unlawful aggression. Fourth, that the actions of Sarah Brennan in providing medical aid to the wounded and facilitating peaceful cooperation between former adversaries exemplify the highest ideals of American citizenship. Reed paused, his eyes scanning the room. The commission therefore recommends full prosecution of Luther Pike and his associates, substantial financial compensation for all victims of railroad violence, and formal recognition of the cooperative agreements established in Black Elk Valley as a model for future territorial development. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah felt tears threatening, not of joy exactly, but of relief so deep it bordered on disbelief. Across the room, she saw Emma Carlson openly weeping, clutching a photograph of her murdered husband. Even Mapia's stoic facade cracked slightly, revealing a glimmer of satisfaction. But Reed wasn't finished. Furthermore, the commission recognizes the unique nature of the community that has emerged here. We recommend the establishment of Black Elk Valley as a special administrative district jointly governed by elected representatives of both settler and native populations, with Mrs. Brennan serving as territorial mediator. The implications were staggering. Not just vindication, but official sanction for their experiment in cooperation, a legal framework for the future they had been building with blood and hope. There is, however, a condition, Reed continued, his tone becoming stern. The railroad still requires passage through this region. The Commission proposes a limited right-of-way, with fair compensation to be paid jointly to the settler community and the Sioux tribes, and with strict environmental protections in place. This is not negotiable. The economic development of the territory demands rail connection, but it can be achieved without violence or displacement. Sarah glanced at Mapia, reading the calculation in his eyes. It was a compromise, less than total victory, but more than they had dared hope for. The chief nodded slowly. "We accept," Sarah said, speaking for them all, "with the understanding that any future development must be approved by the Joint Council." Reed smiled, a rare expression on his stern features. "Agreed. I'll leave copies of the full report and the proposed governance structure. The territorial legislature will need to ratify everything, but I don't anticipate opposition. The newspapers have made you all into heroes. Politicians ignore public opinion at their peril." As the commission members prepared to depart, Reed approached Sarah privately. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," he said quietly. "But you know the real work is just beginning. Making this arrangement permanent, making it work day by day. That's harder than any battle." "I know," Sarah replied, "but we've learned something important. When survival is at stake, people can overcome almost any difference. We just need to remember that we're all trying to survive in our own ways." Reed nodded thoughtfully. "I hope you're right, Mrs. Brennan. The country needs more examples like this." After the delegation left, the community erupted in celebration. Drums and fiddles created an unlikely musical fusion as people danced in the yard. Food appeared as, if by magic, venison roasted Sioux style, fresh bread from the settlers' ovens, wild berries gathered by the children. It was a feast of cultures, a tangible representation of what they had achieved. Sarah found herself standing apart, watching the celebration with a mixture of joy and contemplation. So much had changed since that stormy night when she dragged a wounded warrior into her cabin. She had changed, transformed from a widow focused on mere survival into something she was still learning to define: leader, mediator, symbol of possibility. "You are troubled," Dakota said, appearing beside her with his characteristic silence. Sarah smiled slightly. "Not troubled. Overwhelmed, perhaps. 6 months ago, I just wanted to be left alone to raise my daughter. Now I'm responsible for all this." "You were always responsible," Dakota countered. "You just didn't know it yet. The moment you chose to help a stranger, you accepted responsibility for the world you wanted to create." She turned to face him, studying the man who had become so much more than ally or friend. Their relationship had evolved slowly, cautiously, mindful of the cultural bridge they were building. But the connection between them was undeniable, forged in crisis, tempered by shared purpose, deepened by genuine understanding. "And you?" she asked. "Your father speaks of you as his successor. Will you lead your people when the time comes?" Dakota's expression grew thoughtful. "Leadership takes many forms. My father leads through strength and wisdom. But perhaps what our people need now is someone who can walk between worlds, who understands both the old ways and the new necessities. Someone like you. Like us," he corrected gently. "What we build here together, it's not just about land or laws. It's about showing that different peoples can share the same future without losing themselves." As if summoned by their conversation, Clara ran up, breathless with excitement. She grabbed Sarah's hand with one of hers and Dakota's with the other. "Come dance," she demanded. "Everyone's dancing together." They allowed themselves to be pulled into the celebration, joining the circle of dancers that included both cultures, both generations, all united in the simple joy of survival and hope. Sarah caught Mapia's eye across the circle. The chief nodded approvingly, his own granddaughter dancing beside Clara. As the sun set over Black Elk Valley, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The violence hadn't ended completely. There were still those on both sides who resented the alliance, who wished for the simpler clarity of us versus them. But they had proven something important, that cooperation was possible, that shared humanity could overcome inherited hatred. The railroad would come as it must. Progress would march across the prairie, bringing both opportunity and challenge. But now it would come on terms that respected all people, that acknowledged the legitimate claims of both native tribes and determined settlers. It wasn't a perfect solution. Perfection was a luxury the frontier rarely afforded, but it was just, and it was theirs. That night, after the celebration had wound down and families had returned to their homes, Sarah sat on her porch with Dakota, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from deep understanding. "I received a letter from the Indian agency yesterday," Dakota said eventually. "They want me to serve as official liaison between the Sioux bands and the territorial government. It would mean traveling frequently, spending time in the white settlements and the traditional camps equally." Sarah's heart tightened slightly. She had known this moment would come, when the broader world would claim them for larger purposes. "It's important work," she said carefully. "You're uniquely qualified for it." "Yes," he agreed, "but I wanted to discuss it with you first, because wherever this path leads, I want to walk it with you beside me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sarah had been a widow for over a year now, had rebuilt her life from the ashes of loss. The thought of binding herself to another, especially across such cultural divides, both thrilled and terrified her. "The challenges would be significant," she said softly. "There are many who would never accept such a union." "Since when have we concerned ourselves with what others accept?" Dakota replied with a slight smile. "We've already done the impossible, brought peace where there was only conflict. Perhaps it's time to show that love can flourish where hatred once ruled." Sarah looked at him, this man who had entered her life as an enemy and become essential to her happiness. She thought of Clara, who already treated him as family. She thought of the community they had built, founded on the principle that difference need not mean division. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's walk that path together." The kiss that followed was gentle, a seal on promises too profound for words. Around them, the night sounds of the prairie continued, crickets chirping, owls calling, the distant howl of coyotes. But here, in this moment, there was only peace. The seasons turned, as they always do. The railroad came to Black Elk Valley, its iron rails cutting across the landscape like sutures on a healing wound. But it came peacefully, with proper compensation and environmental safeguards. The station they built became a meeting place, where Sioux traders sold beadwork and buffalo robes to Eastern tourists, where settler children learned Lakota words from their native classmates. Sarah and Dakota married in a ceremony that blended traditions, Christian vows spoken under the open sky, Sioux blessings performed around a sacred fire. Clara stood as witness, beaming with joy at the formal recognition of what her heart had known for months. Even the most skeptical observers had to admit that the couple represented something larger than themselves, a living symbol of the possible. The Joint Council met monthly, working through the inevitable conflicts with patience and growing wisdom. There were setbacks, moments when old prejudices flared, when misunderstandings threatened to undo their progress. But the foundation held, strengthened by shared trials and common purpose. Sarah's role as territorial mediator expanded, taking her to other regions where similar conflicts simmered. Often she brought representatives from Black Elk Valley with her Sioux warriors and white homesteaders who could testify to the power of cooperation. Their message was simple: if we could do it, so can you. Dakota's work as liaison proved equally vital. He moved between worlds with fluid grace, translating not just languages but cultures. His presence in the territorial capital challenged stereotypes, while his connections to traditional bands helped ease the transition to a new era. But always, they returned to Cedar Ridge Farm, to the cabin where it had all begun. Clara grew tall and strong, equally comfortable in doeskin and calico, speaking 3 languages with youthful fluency. She represented the future they were building, one where identity was not limited by blood or birthplace, but expanded by experience and choice. Chief Mahpia lived to see his vision realized, passing to the spirit world one winter night with his family gathered around him. His funeral brought hundreds to Black Elk Valley, Sioux from distant bands, settlers who had learned to call him friend, government officials who had come to respect his wisdom. As they laid him to rest on the hill overlooking the valley, Sarah reflected on how one man's courage to trust had changed the course of history. The years flowed by like the streams that fed the valley, sometimes turbulent, often peaceful, always moving forward. The experimental community of Black Elk Valley became a model, studied by academics and politicians, proof that the American experiment could encompass more than conquest and displacement. Sarah and Dakota had children of their own, twins who carried the heritage of both peoples in their blood and their upbringing. Watching them play with the other valley children, no one could tell where one culture ended and another began. They were simply children of the prairie, inheritors of a future their parents had fought to create. On the 10th anniversary of the alliance, the community held a commemoration. Speakers came from across the territory and beyond, journalists who had covered the story, politicians who had initially opposed the experiment, military officers who had expected to suppress an uprising and instead witnessed a miracle of cooperation. Sarah stood before the assembled crowd, her hair now touched with silver, her face marked by years of sun and struggle. Beside her stood Dakota, his warrior's bearing softened by time, but his presence still commanding respect. 10 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying across the packed meadow, this valley ran red with blood and black with burnt dreams. Fear ruled our hearts and hatred clouded our vision. But in our darkest hour, we discovered a truth that changed everything. Our humanity is stronger than our differences. She paused, looking out at the faces before her, red and white, young and old, all united in this moment of remembrance. We didn't erase our differences. We didn't abandon our traditions or forget our histories. We simply chose to honor what connects us rather than what divides us. We chose hope over fear, cooperation over conquest, understanding over ignorance. Dakota stepped forward. My father once told me that the prairie teaches patience, that grass cut down always grows back, that storms pass, but the earth endures. We have been that grass, bending but not breaking. We have been that earth, enduring what seemed unendurable, and now we bloom. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah barely heard it. Her eyes were on the horizon, where the next generation was already riding out to face new challenges. Clara, now 16, led a group of young people on a surveying expedition, mapping areas for sustainable development. They rode with easy confidence, these children of two worlds who saw no contradiction in their blended heritage. "Look at them," Sarah murmured to Dakota. "They don't even realize how impossible their existence once seemed." "That's as it should be," he replied. "Each generation should find the previous one's impossibilities mundane. That's how we progress." As the sun set on the anniversary celebration, Sarah found herself once again on the porch of Cedar Ridge Farm. The cabin had been expanded over the years but retained its essential character, a place of shelter, of healing, of transformation. Dakota joined her, along with their children and the extended family of choice they had built. Together, they watched the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in violence and now blessed their life in peace. "Do you ever wonder," Dakota asked quietly, "what would have happened if you had left me in that storm?" Sarah smiled, taking his hand. "Every single day, and every single day, I'm grateful I didn't." In the distance, a train whistle echoed. Across the valley, not a sound of threat now, but of connection, of a world growing closer together. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, whispering through the grass that had grown over old battlegrounds. Some stories end with sunset rides into the unknown. Others close with dramatic victories or tragic defeats. But the story of Black Elk Valley ended, if it can be said to end at all, with something rarer and more precious, ordinary life made extraordinary by the courage to see enemies as potential friends, strangers as future family, and difference as a source of strength rather than division. Sarah Brennan, who had once stood alone against the storm, now stood surrounded by the community she had helped create. The wounded warrior she had saved had become her partner in building a new world. The daughter she had protected now led others into the future. The enemies who had threatened everything had either joined them in peace or faded into history's footnotes. This was her legacy, not just survival, but transformation. Not just personal happiness, but communal hope. Not just a story of what was, but a promise of what could be. As the evening deepened and families prepared for rest, Sarah remained on the porch a moment longer. Somewhere out there, in other valleys and on other frontiers, similar struggles continued. People faced the choice between fear and understanding, between isolation and connection. To them, she whispered a prayer carried on the prairie wind. Choose courage, choose compassion, choose each other. Because in the end, that's all any of them had done. Chosen to see the humanity in supposed enemies, chosen to build bridges instead of walls, chosen to believe that the future could be different from the past. The stars wheeled overhead, eternal, witnesses to humanity's brief dramas. But in Black Elk Valley, those dramas had yielded something lasting. Proof that peace was possible, that different peoples could share the same soil without losing themselves, that love could indeed conquer all. Sarah went inside, joining her family around the hearth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the difficult art of living together. But tonight, there was warmth and light and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. The prairie settled into sleep, cradled by ancient hills and endless sky. And in one valley at least, the dreams were of peace. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass. These up, just click and check them out.